What kind of sci-fi bullshit is this?
We got a big stinky on aisle 4. I repeat, a big stinky on aisle 4.
This is part 2 of my look at the Resident Evil 3 Remake. I recommend watching the first part before this one because they are intended to be companion pieces to show how your background with the series and Resident Evil 3 specifically will affect your enjoyment of this remake. Originally, I was recording the PS1 classic of Resident Evil 3 Nemesis on the PS3, but then I ran into a bug where my analog stick wasn't being registered anymore, so then I used Resident Evil 3 Seamless HD, which is a mod for the GameCube version, and a link for it will be in the description below. In part 1, I gave my initial impressions after completing my first playthrough, not having played the original. I suspected the fact that I enjoyed the game more than RE2 Remake was due to not having the context of the original, so changes didn't bother me, and that ended up only being half correct. While I wish they brought over some of the areas from the original, I would complain that the bigger issue is that there isn't anything significant to fill the gaps in their omission, nothing that, while different, conveys their ideas, mood, and tone. RE2 Remake isn't a one-to-one recreation of the original either, but the RPD still conveys the same idea as the original. The issue with RE2 Remake isn't that the events and building aren't one-to-one exactly as I remember it was the fact that you're doing the same exact thing twice while calling it scenario A and B, and depending on who you ask, the game's atmosphere relying too much on everything being so dark to be scary, unlike the original which used well-placed camera angles and unsettling music. But inevitably, some of these things are going to be lost with the change in perspective. RE3 Remake, on the other hand, is a far more complicated game to analyze since it is so different from the original that a more fitting title for the game would be Resident Evil 3 Reimagined. Sure, you can just compare what is and isn't there from RE3 Nemesis, but I think that's only a surface level way of looking at this remake. Both RE3 Remake and RE3 Nemesis, which I'll be referring to as 3Make and 3Nem for the rest of this video for simplicity, do things better and worse than each other, which is why I think it is so hard for me to make a judgment on these games, especially since both of them are new games to me. For as much as this game is a bad remake, it is equally as good as a unique experience with some glaring issues that we'll get into. I don't think change in and of itself is a bad thing either. This is why I didn't bring up cut content in part 1, since without context I see nothing to add other than a list of changes which doesn't mean anything by themselves. Both remakes, the one people adore and the one people are divided on, cut enemies and content, but you won't hear me crying over the crows or moths being removed. To minimize the all-over-the-place nature this video could easily fall into, going back and forth from two very different games, let's look at them side by side and see how they progress and compare and contrast what each does good, bad, and unique. One of 3Nem's uniquest aspects is the fact that the game has a lot of randomness to it. Certain items have the chance of being in multiple different areas per playthrough, like you could either get the Magnum or the grenade launcher at the start and the RPD. Certain areas also have the chance of being populated with different enemies. For example, this part of the park can be filled with either hunter gammas or a few zombies. This is one of the features that brings a lot of replayability to 3Nem, because even on one playthrough, enemies will be shifted around if you die, which keeps areas and your playthrough fresh and unique. 3Make, on the other hand, locks this behind the Nightmare and Inferno difficulties, which you can only unlock Nightmare by beating the game on Hardcore, and you can only unlock Inferno by beating the game on Nightmare. This should have been a unique setting that you can pick at the start of each playthrough, giving you the ability to play assisted standard Hardcore, Nightmare, and Inferno with the randomized items and enemies so it would play similar to the original, or a set in stone version where the enemies and items will always be in the same place, which is how the first 3 difficulties work in the game we ended up getting. The ink ribbon save system that was brought back for RE2 Remake also should have been its own unique system in that game, instead of being locked behind harder difficulties, which is also oddly missing from this game. I will always champion the idea that players should be able to adjust and tweak the game to how they want to with difficulties thanks to multiple options. Old game examples of this are the Silent Hill games, which allowed you to have a regular difficulty option and a puzzle difficulty option. Granted, those settings were pretty binary, but that's besides the point. point, and a good modern example of this is the new Hitman games, which give you a plethora of options to tweak the game to how you want it to be. Do you want it to play more like Absolution? You can. Do you want it to play more like the originals without giving you a lot of hints? You can. I find the remixing of items in 3 Remake also rather lacking. It was cool to start with the Magnum from the get-go, but a bunch of scripted items are still where you normally find them. You still get the lockpick in the same spot. You still get the bolt cutter in the same spot. You still get the shotgun in the same spot. At least I did in my playthrough, so if they actually can be in different places, I just got unlucky with the RNG. 3 Remake opens to Jill having a nightmare in her apartment, suffering from PTSD after the events of RE1. I think this opening is great, showcasing the calm before the storm that isn't present in the original, but on repeat playthroughs it feels slow and gets in the way. There probably should have been some feature to allow you to just have this automatically skipped when you try to do new playthroughs, like a speedrunner mode. Both of these games do a great job at showing the initial chaos of the outbreak. 3 Nem with the streets overrun by zombies and the amazing opening cinematic showing off soldiers fighting the horde, and 3 Remake with Nemesis chasing Jill through the building, only for her to stumble into the burning streets. A nitpicky thing that bothers me with Jill in the remake is how she sleeps through all of this happening out in the streets, and the fact that her building is on fire without any alarms going off to warn her. Before Nemesis bursts through her walls, she seems relatively oblivious to what's going on outside, only making this one comment as she's closing her window. But you would think there would be way more commotion that she would notice, considering as soon as you get onto the fire escape, buildings are exploding, cars are crashing, people are screaming in the streets. Either way, I really don't think that this opening goes too over the top with the action. Sure, it's flashy with the explosions, but I don't think it's anything more than 3 Nem's opening, which first moments of actual in-game cutscenes is Jill being blown out of a building into a car. Where 3 Remake fails in its display of the city falling apart is how the dial feels like it's turned down from an 11 to a 1 after you get to the train station. You come out from it right after talking to Carlos and gearing up, and this is the only other time you see any survivors. There are no more explosions or people running around. The fires seem relatively tame, all things considered. They only start to get out of hand when you're running from Nemesis back to the train station after you get it running again, making the chaos feel really scripted. It feels like the chaos quelled in the span of 5 minutes. You never run into any survivors fighting for their lives like the blonde girl in 3 Nem. We never run back into Dario like in the original either. The closest thing we get is sounds of gunfire off in the distance, which you can faintly hear in the mix, and the cop on the radio as you pass by the RPD on your way to Kendo's, which I don't think there's a way to ever see these people. This makes the game's world feel incredibly small. There was only ever one meaningful change to the game's world, and while I loved this change, it's locked away behind the nightmare difficulty. There was a zombie banging on the door to the diner, so I wasn't able to get in from the entrance like I had in my previous 2 playthroughs. This required me to go through the side alley via the catwalk, go through the building with the safe, and go in the diner from the back and kill the zombie to actually be able to open the door. This was awesome. If only there was more of this, but the game's level design does not lend itself to ever do this trick again, only adding to the disappointment. This, on the other hand, is one of 3 Nem's greatest strengths, its ever-evolving city as you progress through the game. Streets get repopulated with new enemies depending on what you do, adding variety to gameplay. Depending on which objective you do first, the streets leading to the RPD can either be filled with dogs or overrun by a ton of zombies. On the other hand, once you clear out streets in 3 Remake, they barely repopulate, and if they do, it's not to any meaningful degree to give the feeling that the city is truly going to shit. Not only is the city far more stagnant in the remake, it's only after going through the original does the feeling of how small this city really is start to show. The only thing that really feels like the honeycomb building on top of itself nature that you come to love with the classic Resident Evil level design is kicking this ladder down, and even then it doesn't do much since there's a street right next to it, yet also connects via the catwalk and the diner, so what exactly is the point? This really isn't a shortcut, it's just a third lane to go through. I have no problem with linearity. I've said in other videos that when people complain about games being too linear, most of the time it's actually a compounding of other issues than the fact that the game is linear. The city is by far the most interesting and best section in both of these games, but in 3 Remake, you are done with the city exploration in your first hour. I would say that's a bigger issue than linearity. The game, environmental-wise, has peaked in its first hour and a half. The power plant in 3 Remake is now a combination of the power plant in the construction area in 3 Nem. This is where the drain demos are introduced and the only area you fight them in the remake, along with being much smaller, having a somewhat cricket-like appearance rather than the weird bug creatures from the original. I think this is a solid area that keeps the tension at a good height thanks to the mixing of sounds, tight hallways, and score. The only issue I have is the fact that enemies run at a lower frame rate, as I mentioned in part 1, draining some of the tension in this area. After their introduction in the construction site in 3 Nem, the drain demos become a regular enemy you could run into in the world. In 3 Remake, this is the only area you see them in the game, which adds to the issue of stagnation within the city, along with the lack of enemy variety throughout the rest of the game. I mentioned earlier that Nightmare remixes enemy placements, and due to this lack of enemy variety, it really doesn't feel all that meaningful or memorable. Most of it is just having the Plagueis-like enemies with the tentacles that stab you be in the game way earlier before Nemesis shows up to infect them, or throw a shit ton more zombies at you at any given time. So many in some cases that they're literally raining from the sky. 3 of the enemy types in this game are just relegated to one area. The Hunter Gammas are only in the sewers and in that one container in the lab, which wasn't even in this playthrough. The drain demos are only in the power plant area and never seen again. The Hunters are only really in the hospital. I ran into one getting the 3rd fuse in the lab in this playthrough, but the rest were only for Carlos. Maybe if the game had more enemy variety, this could have led to the remixing being way more memorable, like it is in higher difficulties in Devil May Cry. Brad has about the same amount of screen time in each game, and which version you prefer will come down to personal tastes. I'm pretty indifferent to his death via Nemesis or buying time for Jill to escape. I think both versions do a fine job in having a friend character lost in the opening hour of the game, but I will say I love the scene he gets later in the game where he bites Marvin in the remake, even if the scene is admittedly somewhat contrived. This is the only time you see a zombie do this, so Marvin can falter in killing his friend so then he can get bitten and run into Leon so the events in RE2 can happen. Unlike my indifference to Brad, I like both versions of Carlos. I do like the modern design a lot more though. Messy hair is where it's at, but I think both versions are a product of the B action movies of their time. Carlos in 3 Nem is a hot-headed show-off who is incredibly infatuated with himself and thinks he is way cooler than he actually is. While a competent action hero, he is also somewhat of a bumbling buffoon at times, which is propped up a lot by his voice acting. Carlos in 3 Remake, on the other hand, I would say is a more cool, suave-like character. He still retains the same ego of thinking he is cooler than he actually is, but he plays more towards modern action heroes, making quips at events happening before him. I'm glad that 3 Remake gave Carlos a lot more playtime, since in 3 Nem you play for him at most 20 minutes, with you trying to get the cure for Jill in the hospital. As for the rest of the characters, it was cool that Tyrell got to be more fleshed out in 3 Remake when only being in one scene in 3 Nem. Mikhail trades out his cool don't come any closer scene from 3 Nem with having a better design and being conscious the entire time he's in the game. Nikolai is more overtly over the top evil in 3 Remake, going on about making money and in the end shooting the vaccine. This is an issue that Resident Evil has always had to some degree and isn't something unique to Nikolai. But I will say that this got noticeably worse once we switched to the 3rd person perspective. At first, he isn't all that different from his 3 Nem incarnation. He kills Murphy in both, but in 3 Remake, you get to see him kill Murphy right in front of you instead of walking in on him killing him. It's only later in 3 Remake that he becomes more cartoonishly evil, going on about making the money and monologuing to Jill and kicking her into the pit and so on. I'd argue that 3 Nem's Nikolai is just in the game less than 3 Remake's being a worse character. He's underwritten more than anything else. I don't see any of the actions that Nikolai does in 3 Remake that I couldn't believe the 3 Nems wouldn't do. The real annoyance for me in his scenes is how Nemesis is in the background for a lot of them and conveniently either leaves immediately for Nikolai to show up or is idly sitting in the background off screen until the characters are done talking to start the boss fight. Here's my hot take. The story of Resident Evil has always been stupid and campy, and the canon only gets more convoluted with each new entry since they retcon things between each other. Your mileage with the story will vary based on your tolerance for bullshit.
No one dared to oppose them, and that lack of strength would ultimately lead to their destruction. I suppose they had to suffer the consequences of their actions, but there would be no forgiveness. If only they had had the courage to fight.
If only the people of Raccoon City fought back against this evil corporation they didn't know was evil. Yeah, these innocent people and children were not strong enough to stand up to them, so they had to die.
Yeah, this intro characterizes the events in a way that didn't actually happen. Nobody knew that Umbrella was secretly this evil corporation. Only the people who were working for Umbrella and covered everything up knew, like Chief Irons. Stars had no evidence that Umbrella was behind everything because the mansion exploded at the end of RE1. The game does not characterize events like this at all, especially if you read any of the files. Nobody knew what this disease was. Umbrella is actively trying to make sure nothing can be traced back to them, and is telling their mercenaries to actively prioritize people that are associated with them so they can't blow the whistle on them. I think Jill in 3 Remake is an upgrade over her 3 Nem incarnation. After playing the game 3 times, with only one of them having cutscenes and skipping them in the subsequent 2, that version has a lot more staying power in my memory, unlike the Jill from 3 Nem, which I find rather bland. While I can see it getting on the nerves of some people, I really liked her sassy attitude in 3 Remake. I think the reason why she's so much more memorable in this game is because she has Carlos to constantly bounce off of while talking to him over the radio, where in 3 Nem she goes huge stretches of the game without talking to anyone, and even in scenes with multiple characters she won't say a single word in some of them. It also doesn't help the voice actress's very flat delivery of some lines. For the most part, both Jills do the same things. The only real difference is the quality of their voice, and the PTSD setup from the beginning of 3 Remake, which only comes up one more time in the game, and it doesn't really do anything with this idea. It was an interesting setup that they ended up doing nothing with. I could imagine a really cool stalking sequence where Nemesis is following her and it's really scary and tense. Sure, they'd probably have to make this pretty scripted to work effectively, but it just feels like wasted potential. In 3 Remake, they moved Jill's one-liner of "you want stars" to the middle of the game when she's being chased by Nemesis into the sewers. While I think the placement was awkward and it ends up having no impact because of it, it didn't really bother me that much because she still has a fine one-liner at the end when she shoots Nemesis in the mouth. This is probably due to the fact that I have no attachment or reverence for this stars line. The final character I want to talk about is Nemesis. The thing that surprised me is that even in the original, Nemesis isn't in huge stretches of the game as you roam through the streets collecting things to get the train running again. You do fight him far more in 3 Nem, roughly 10 times along with a bunch of cutscenes, where in 3 Remake you see him a total of 10 times, half of which are either set pieces, cutscenes, or a combination of the two. 3 fights are within the span of 30 minutes of each other, that being him bursting through the wall, infecting the zombies by the diner, and chasing you through the train station into the sewer. Too much of the cool things when interacting with Nemesis is relegated to cutscenes instead of player control, or you get this half-assed middle ground where you have to hold the left stick forward, which I don't think is all that engaging either. All of his encounters in Remake, and most of the events in the game in general, are ruined by the autosave feature because it gives away that an event is about to happen. Anytime you're about to encounter him, you can see the autosave icon in the top left corner and you go, oh, I guess something's gonna happen now. Where in 3 Nem you never knew where Nemesis was gonna show up on your first playthrough. He always had this looming threat of showing up when you were unprepared to kill you and make you lose progress. An annoying thing I brought up in part 1 was that Jill felt like she had a lot of plot armor in cutscenes because there would have been things that would have killed any other character in the game, but she walks them off fine, like the rocket at point blank. The thing I would say that's even more annoying than that is that Nemesis gets the drop on Jill multiple times by grabbing her by the head or by the neck with his tentacle thing, and has ample ability to crush her head like a grape or snap her in half like a graham cracker, but instead he just throws her a few feet away so she could run away. This bothers me even more when I think back to Ben getting his head crushed in the jail cell by Mr. X in RE2 Remake. Nemesis needs to be either as strong, weak, or competent as the script needs him to be so the plot can move forward. Instead of writing him like the unstoppable force he's supposed to be, he needs to let kill windows slip right through his fingers or do things that would be actively counterintuitive if he's trying to kill a target. All of this builds to having Nemesis not feeling like a threatening enemy and is very forgettable in 3 Remake because of it. Like I said in part 1, I think if we fought him more, it would help cover up some of the issues I just listed. But I still think the bigger problem here is that he is a joke on anything below Nightmare, being downed by a single grenade. Sure, you can fight him with your guns, but why would you? You're just wasting resources. He's such a joke on standard and hardcore that you need to have self-imposed rules in order to get the most out of him. This is also in part due to the change in perspective and controls. The biggest challenge about fighting Nemesis in the original stem from how the game controls versus how he operates. He feels like a monster made for a different game with different controls to convey the idea of being an unstoppable monster that you have little chance of beating. But now with a dodge that doesn't fucking suck because it's no longer random and you don't have situations where you dodge and still get grabbed by Nemesis, making it completely pointless. It also helps having its own dedicated button this time around instead of holding the aim button and the action button as he's about to attack, which why didn't they make it its own button at least in the GameCube version, which leaves a face button unused? I don't think this would break the game because the dodge is still random and doesn't give you iframes, so you still get punished even if you dodge. To put it simply, Nemesis in Remake is too easy. It's only on Nightmare that Nemesis leaves any lasting impression to the player. The Nemesis you fight on Nightmare should have been how he was in Standard and Hardcore. He doesn't go down to one grenade like I mentioned earlier. He's way faster and far more aggressive that he scared me a few times, as you could hear his feet stamping in the background as it rapidly gets closer and louder. His encounters on the streets are really engaging and require your full attention without really feeling too bullshit. I would speculate that Nemesis is only like this in a locked away difficulty because people complain so much about Mr. X, myself included. But unlike Mr. X in RE2 Remake, he has more in common with his original 3Nem incarnation, that there are a ton of areas he can't follow you or won't follow you so it doesn't get too annoying, which I think is the key difference between me finding Mr. X annoying and Nemesis not. Nemesis has enough restrictions that it doesn't feel like he's getting too in the way with me progressing. Who knows, I could be completely wrong on this. If the game was way longer and he was in it far more, similar to Mr. X, maybe I would find him annoying. But as he is, Nemesis on Nightmare should be also in Standard and Hardcore. A lot of people have said that Nightmare is the best way to play this game, and while I don't agree due to the lacking issues I mentioned earlier, even if it was, you shouldn't have the best stuff locked behind a difficulty most people won't play. If this is quote-unquote the best way to experience the piece of media, then why do you have to experience it first in a suboptimal way to get to the good stuff? Players aren't going to experience this if you do it. At the time of recording, only 11% of players on Steam have beaten the game on Nightmare. Most people select standard or normal when they play games, so why not tailor the first impression to be the best one, or something that will only get enhanced on higher difficulties instead of having the game experience diminished from playing it on lower ones? If someone beats this game on normal and didn't like it, what would make them think that 2 difficulties higher that require you to play on hardcore first to unlock would somehow be any better? They're going to play it once, think it was shit, and then never play it again. As for the rest of both of these games, I don't think either are as good after you leave the streets of Raccoon City. The sewer in Remake is my most hated section of that game, and for as much as I saw people mad on social media about the clock tower not being in Remake, it didn't really wow me all that much in 3Nem. Don't get me wrong, it's a good section that probably would have been pretty cool if it was in the remake, but at the same time I would have been perfectly fine if we just got a different new area that was of the same quality. This is what the hospital in Remake is supposed to be, I guess. In 3Nem, the hospital was only a 10-minute section that you play as Carlos, but in Remake, while still more confined than any section in 2 Remake, it's the closest thing we get to classic Resident Evil style multi-item collecting level progression, which the game is sorely lacking. 3Nem didn't have much in the puzzle department either, unless you consider this a puzzle. There was only a few actual puzzles like the water purity one and the dead factory. Most of them were just go here to get item, to go to another place to get another item, to combine them to get a third item to go back to the train. This is what I love about the Resident Evil game level design, but let's not characterize these things as something they're not. In comparison, Remake's item collection is all just single item based. You got the bolt cutter, so you go around and cut all the chains and then you're done with it. You get the lockpick and then you go around and lockpick all the locks until you're done with it. And it's only in the hospital where we get something that's multi-stepped, multi-itemed, and more thought out. You need to get both the cure for Jill and rescue Dr. Bard. To get to Bard, who supposedly has the vaccine, you need to open this voice recognition door, and to do that, you have to take this tape recorder and get a cassette with his voice on it. And to get to the cassette tape that's in the sick room, you need to open this door that's locked with a card reader, and the key card you need to open it is in the staff locker room, and to get to the staff locker room you need to get a key from the courtyard. It's only after you get all of these items and combine them are you able to get into Bard's office, only to find him dead with only one remaining vaccine left. And since this is the only area that does this, I think that's why a lot of people are mad at this game and think it's really linear. I actually like the park in 3Nem far more than the clock tower, and I don't really know why either. I think it's because I would have rather had a more labyrinthian styled park to go through than the clock tower, but it ends up just being another thing that could have been. I think it would have been interesting to see what they would have done with Gravedigger in a modern Resident Evil game, but my other Resident Evil hot take is that boss fights aren't the highlight of this series. Sure, we've had some good ones over the years, but most of the time they're either pretty forgettable or just plain bad, and Gravedigger falls into the kind of forgettable for me. It's okay, I guess. I don't really hate it, I'm just kind of indifferent to its existence. It probably would have made for an interesting set piece, but in reality, all of the cool things about it probably would have been relegated to a cutscene. The final areas for both of these games is, of course, a lab. In 3 Remake, it is underneath the hospital, and in 3Nem, it's the Dead Factory. While both are fine areas by themselves, I think 3Nems is more of an interesting area to go through. In both games, these labs are for getting rid of and disposing zombies and other test subjects, but in 3Nem, this place feels more like a garbage plant than an actual laboratory. It's grimy, it's dirty, it's rusted everywhere, and I think that's what makes it way more interesting than the modern lab aesthetic that was used for the lab in 3 Remake. RE2 Remake's lab wasn't anything amazing either, so for 3 Remakes to be serviceable but incredibly forgettable doesn't surprise me. The Nemesis fight in the factory in 3 Remake also would have been a great spot for a third transformation before the final set piece boss, because like I mentioned in part 1, it does feel like a repeat boss fight from a fight only an hour earlier, and on repeat playthroughs it only gets more and more dull. I think the reason why we didn't get 3Nem's second form of Nemesis in 3 Remake is because technically we already have it. From what I saw, the only thing unique between Form 1 and 2 in 3Nem is the fact that he has the tentacle grab, but base form Nemesis in 3 Remake can already do that, so this transformation would be rather redundant. I think the best course of action would have been amping up the second form from 3Nem in 3 Remake. Instead of just having the single tentacle grab, he has a bunch of tendrils spewing everywhere. Make him way faster, way more aggressive, and move this fight to the courtyard and leave the dog fight for the chem chamber, making both fights unique and giving Nemesis some more memorability. The final boss fight in both games is actually pretty lackluster. In 3Nem, the final boss feels almost like a victory lap. You've already had the hardest encounters, that being Nikolai in the helicopter and Nemesis in the clock tower courtyard, which was originally supposed to be the ending of the game. In 3 Remake, the final Nemesis fight is another giant enemy attached to a wall, which is something we've seen in plenty of other games, like in Resident Evil 7 and RE2 Remake the year prior. On anything below Nightmare, the boss is a complete joke, and is just another fight to add to the pile of soon-to-be forgotten bosses. But on Nightmare, it is one of the worst bosses I've ever fought. I've mentioned this in other videos that higher difficulties often feel like an afterthought to developers, leaving them really unbalanced and unfun to play. This boss is the golden example for that. It feels like this wasn't tested at all. This fight requires you to dodge every single attack perfectly or be stun locked comboed until you die. I tried doing this without the coins at first, but it felt like I was fighting a brick wall. I thought, okay, maybe this is balanced with the coins in mind. Nope, even with all of the coins, it still can chain slam you into the ground over and over again, but instead of dying in 1 to 2 hits, you now die in 3 to 4. So you just get to sit there longer and not have control over your character. More than half of my deaths in this playthrough were from this boss. And I know I'm not the only person who had the same issues, because I watched streams of this difficulty like from Maximilian, and he was having a terrible time and hated this boss just as much as I did. This final boss fight sours what I think was an overall okay hard difficulty, and makes me have zero intention in trying out Inferno because I've been told it's even worse, and I only see this as a net negative for my time and enjoyment. The final thing I want to talk about side by side is the ending itself. I saw a decent amount of people who were mad that Barry didn't show up at the end to save Jill and Carlos. As someone who has zero reverence for Barry as a character, other than the memes from RE1's original terrible voice acting, the fact he doesn't show up at the end doesn't bother me at all. The story never hinged on Barry saving them, and even if it did, the story in 3 Remake has changed enough that it doesn't matter here either. Like how Carlos now goes through the RPD instead of Jill, which was also another short section in 3 Nem, so I don't have any nostalgia to be mad that she didn't go through it, and in the context of this story, it makes perfect sense. If we could have had one thing from the original carried over to the remake, I wish it was the live event system. I genuinely think it's a really cool system and added a lot of replay value to 3 Nem, just by seeing how things played out differently and how the game would change because of it. Of course, not all of them brought meaningful differences, at least from the experimenting I did, but its inclusion in 3 Remake would have made the game a lot more interesting and give more replay value because I think 3 Nem definitely has more than the remake. Most viewers probably came into this video expecting a definitive answer on which is better and if the remake sucks or not, but I'm gonna give you the cop-out answer. I genuinely think both of these games are worth playing. One does not invalidate the existence of the other. If anything, both of these side by side allow you to appreciate different aspects of both of them. Resident Evil 3 2020 is a much better standalone game than it is a remake. I would not call this game lazy because it takes too much fucking work to make a game even of this quality, which all things considered isn't even that bad. And I don't think most games can be called lazy. More appropriate terms would be incompetent, uninspired, misguided, or rushed, and I would definitely call this game rushed. Just by playing it, you can feel this intangible metric of unrefinement. Get 3 Remake for $40 or cheaper on sale if you are still on the fence about buying it, and if you're a hardcore fan of the original, don't go in expecting RE2 Remake or something that is faithful to 3 Nem. This game is more of a reimagining than anything else. Like I said, if you want to use the 3 Nem Seamless HD mod, the link for it will be in the description below, or you can play the PS3 port of the PS1 Classic, which is only $6.99 US. If you've made it this far into the video, I just want to say thanks for watching as always. If you liked the channel and this video, maybe consider leaving a like, subscribing, and hitting the bell so you never miss an upload because the sub box is unreliable. And if you really like the channel, maybe consider becoming a supporter on Patreon. I want to give a shout out to my $5 and up patrons: Oods of Nudes, HB33, Star Fox, Scarlet Kingdom, Flarbu, Mitchell, Joshua D. Larino, Chichomatrius, Bully, Benjamin Johnson, and Poke Joke S. You guys are awesome. Thanks so much for supporting the channel. If you're a card game player of any kind, I have a TCG Player affiliate link in the description below. Any purchases you make using my link will give me a small kickback and help support the channel. As always, thanks for watching guys, and see you next time.